Welcome to Voxrupt.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the podcast that, tries to cut through the noise and get to the heart of what's really going on.
That's the goal.
And today we're diving into something many people thought was kind of settled history, maybe relegated to textbooks.
But it really isn't.
Not at all. It's very much alive and well and constantly transforming. We're talking about that age-old clash between capitalism and socialism.
Yeah, but it's gone way beyond just economics or politics now, hasn't it?
Totally. It's become this really profound, almost unending battle right at the core of our culture, our ethics, even how we define ourselves as human beings.
That's a powerful way to frame it. And for this deep dive, our mission really is to unpack how these two, massive worldviews have evolved.
Right.
We want to trace their intellectual roots, look at their historical track records, which are often pretty complicated.
Oh, definitely.
And crucially, see how they're showing up now, in pop culture, the digital age, and how that's shaping our reality in sometimes surprising ways.
And we'll also explore the unexpected ways they've actually influenced each other.
Mm-hmm.
And the really critical questions they force us to ask about big concepts like freedom, justice, even meaning itself.
Yeah.
So our goal today is simple. Cut through the slogans, get past the surface stuff, and help you gain a more nuanced view on what this whole ongoing confrontation means for you and, for society. Okay, let's get into it.
Right. So after the Soviet Union collapsed, there was this widespread idea, wasn't there, that socialism had definitively failed.
Yeah, like capitalism won, end of story.
Exactly. But that idea, it turned out to be pretty premature. The reality is socialism didn't just vanish. It came back, often in new, maybe less obvious forms.
That's fascinating. So where are we seeing these new forms pop up most noticeably today?
Well, you definitely see it in universities. Things like critical theory, that way of analyzing power structures, how they create inequality, and what some people call cultural Marxism, which sort of shifts the focus from economic class to cultural identity. Then you see it filtering into the media with these pervasive victim-centered narratives, demands for social justice.
Right.
And politically, it's there too, a kind of new leftism that centers on identity politics, anti-neoliberal slogans, basically critiquing that free market, small government approach we've seen for decades.
So it wasn't like socialist economic theories suddenly proved themselves again. It sounds like something else was driving this resurgence.
Precisely. And paradoxically, it was often capitalism's own, let's say, structural weaknesses that fueled it.
How so?
Well, think about the financial crises we've had. The growing inequality that just seems persistent, the erosion of public trust in big institutions.
Yeah, you can definitely feel that.
Right. So capitalism's own struggles, its failure sometimes to live up to its own promises, kind of open the door for these other ideas to gain traction again.
Okay, so this means the fight isn't just about who owns the factories anymore or how wealth gets distributed.
No.
It sounds like the deeper battle has shifted.
Dramatically. It's become about identity, about ethics, about finding meaning. Capitalism, at its core, really emphasizes individual freedom, private property, free competition. Yeah. It often frames the human as this autonomous being, right? Capable of forging their own destiny.
Sure, the self-made individual.
In stark contrast, socialism tends to stress structural equality, collective control, often rejecting private ownership. This worldview sees the human as fundamentally social, needing collective justice.
So the core tension now is what?
It really boils down to a fundamental question. Is the human being primarily this free, autonomous entity? Or are we perhaps better understood as potentially victimized beings needing some form of collective salvation?
Wow. Yeah, that's a deep question. It gets right to the heart of it.
It really does.
So, okay, let's dig into the intellectual foundations then. The pillars holding up these two opposing worldviews. Starting with capitalism, it really stands on three main ideas, doesn't it? Individualism, private property, and freedom of choice.
Absolutely. And these ideas mostly come out of the Enlightenment, classical liberalism. Individualism sees the person as autonomous, rational, responsible. Society is basically a collection of these free individuals. Private property isn't just about owning stuff. It's often seen as like an extension of your identity, a guarantee of independence, a space to be creative.
Right, your own little sphere.
Exactly. And freedom of choice views the market not just economically, but as a vital space for liberty. Competition drives innovation, progress. That's the theory.
And the state's role in all this. Keep it minimal. Just preserve order, protect rights. The main claim is liberty comes before justice.
Right. But then you have socialism, which takes a fundamentally different fork in the road.
How so? What are its core pillars?
Well, it emphasizes structural equality, collective control, usually of the means of production, and a rejection of private ownership. The roots are often in Marxist critiques, this strong idealism about justice.
So equality means
It generally means people should have equal access to resources, opportunities, power. Systemic inequality is seen as inherently wrong, morally unacceptable.
okay, and collective control.
The idea is that society, not individuals, should own the big economic engines, factories, land, etc. Private ownership is often viewed as the source of exploitation.
And the state's role here is much bigger, presumably.
Oh, much bigger. Central planning, distributing resources, guiding society. Often the individual is seen as part of the collective good, sometimes subordinate to it. The core claim is justice, even if achieving it means, restricting certain freedoms.
This brings up a really important, maybe uncomfortable question. Looking at history, could you argue that socialism, despite the justice slogans, sometimes ended up being kind of anti-human? What makes some say it turns people into tools?
That's a really crucial point to grapple with. In many historical socialist systems, you saw individuality suppressed for the collective, ownership abolished for structural justice, individual choice restricted by central planning. So yeah, in practice, it can end up viewing humans less as inherently free beings and more as, controllable and engineerable units within this larger social machine.
And historically?
Historically, that perspective arguably paved the way for regimes like the Soviet Union, Mao's China, Cuba, North Korea. Places where the stated goal of justice became a justification for repression, censorship, getting rid of dissent.
So it seems like a key difference is that capitalism, even with all its crises, it at least kept the door open for critique, for reform, for changing things.
Right. The possibility remained.
Whereas in those socialist examples, freedom itself was often sacrificed. And without freedom, maybe justice just becomes another word for power.
That's a critical distinction, yeah. A system without the possibility of critique is dangerous.
Okay, so moving from those foundations,
Yeah.
let's trace how leftist thought itself evolved. Because it really strayed quite far from Marx's original economic focus, didn't it?
It really did. Take orthodox Marxism, like in the Soviet Union. It basically became a tool of the state. Dialectics replaced debate, and the working class became a label used to crush any opposition. Then, later in the 20th century, you get cultural Marxism coming out of the Frankfurt School. This was a big shift.
How so?
The focus moved away from purely economic class towards cultural identity. Critiques of capitalism expanded into broader critiques of Western civilization as self, family structures, religion, traditional values.
And more recently, these ideas seem to have merged with other schools of thought, like postmodernism, radical feminism, post-colonial theory.
Exactly. Frameworks that challenge traditional narratives, power dynamics, often leading to this intense focus on victim-centered stories.
What's interesting there is how this new left seems different from the old left. Less about the industrial working class, maybe, and more about cultural, sexual, racial, ethnic identities.
Yes, that's a key shift. And while it seems like an expansion of the idea of justice, some argue it has unfortunately led to this kind of systematic construction of victimhood. Meaning social groups started being defined less by their capabilities or common goals and more by their perceived suffering. And victimhood itself became a sort of moral high ground, a kind of privilege.
So any critique, even if it's rational, gets shut down as symbolic violence or an attack.
That's often the dynamic, yes. If someone is identified with a victim group, their identity can become almost sacred. Questioning it is immediately labeled racism, sexism, Islamophobia, whatever fits.
And the result seems to be, what, a kind of competition.
A competition over victimhood, as some put it, replacing the competition over truth. And this ties into how certain concepts get used. Take social justice or minority rights. Sometimes they seem to be used to pull ethical debates out of the realm of rational discussion and turn them into tools to silence opposition.
So ethics becomes a weapon.
It can, yeah. Rather than a standard to judge behavior, it becomes a way to shut down dissent. Critique isn't just an opinion, it's framed as violence or hate speech.
And what about things like inclusive discourse, psychological safety, safe spaces? Is the idea that this language intentionally narrows the scope of what can be discussed?
That's certainly one interpretation. It potentially creates boundaries where certain ideas are just considered out of bounds, protecting a specific narrative.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. Some people have floated this provocative idea that the new left functions almost like a secular religion, What's the argument there?
It is provocative, but you can see the outlines of the argument. The god maybe is social justice. The prophets are often presented as history's victims.
Kind of sacred text.
Could be seen as critical theory. But the key difference proponents of this idea argue is that it tends to replace reason with a kind of faith.
How so?
Belief in things like structural oppression is often taken as a given, maybe without needing traditional forms of proof. Sin isn't necessarily about individual actions, but about identity being white, male, Western, can itself be framed as a transgression.
And salvation.
Maybe comes through public confession, apology, repentance, not necessarily through concrete reform. This kind of framework can make it very resistant to rational critique, because rationality itself might be viewed as part of the oppressive structure.
Wow. That's quite a framework to consider. Okay, let's flip the coin now and look at capitalism, because it has its own paradox, right? Is it really about freedom, or can it morph into its own kind of exploitation? That idealized free market image. It doesn't always match reality, does it?
Not really, no. In practice, the free market can often become what some call a market of domination. Well, power doesn't just come from fair competition. Think about global monopolies, big tech, energy, finance. These giants don't just compete. They often shape the rules, influence regulations, even mold public opinion.
And freedom of choice.
Often feels more like a privilege than a universal right, doesn't it? I mean, if you can't afford decent health care or good education or even healthy food, how free are your choices, really? Unequal access is a huge factor.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then there's the political influence of capital. Lobbying, campaign donations, that whole revolving door between government and industry. It often shields the system from serious critique, lets it present itself as just the way things are, the natural order, rather than a system people built.
I'm thinking about neoliberalism, that whole small government, big market push since the 80s. It seems to have generated its own crises. We saw the 2008 financial crash, obviously.
A direct result of deregulation and capital getting concentrated, yeah.
But what were the broader consequences beyond just finance?
Oh, they're profound. Widening inequality, income, education, healthcare access. You see the middle class shrinking in many developed countries, public trust in institutions, it's plummeted.
Definitely feel that.
And there's this creeping commodification of everything. Education, healthcare, even relationships sometimes get viewed through this purely transactional lens. Price tags replacing intrinsic value. These aren't just economic problems. They feel like deeper moral, even intellectual failures, where profit just overshadows everything else.
Which leads us back to how capitalism's own flaws seem to create openings for the left. Every market crash, every inequality report, it just seems to provide ammunition.
Exactly. It becomes a pretext for the left's resurgence. They can highlight the class divides and position themselves as defenders of justice, maybe without always offering super concrete solutions. They critique the commodification of life, framing themselves as guardians of values, even, sometimes ironically, turning those values into ideological weapons themselves.
Right.
And they skillfully leverage public distrust to amplify those victim narratives we talked about, perhaps without fully critiquing the whole structure of victimhood itself.
So it creates this weird cycle.
It feels like it. Capitalism's failures fuel the left's rise, but the left's rise, focused maybe more on division than solutions, can sometimes lead to more instability, rather than fixing the underlying problems.
But what about the right's role in this? Is there a critique to be made about their own, maybe, laziness? Just repeating the freedom slogan without updating it, denying structural issues. Does that inadvertently help the left's case?
That's a really important question. When the right just sanctifies the market without engaging in serious ethical critique, when they don't reinterpret freedom for today's world or acknowledge deep structural problems, yeah, you could argue they kind of cede the moral high ground. And the result isn't really a win for either side. It feels more like a loss for rational, nuanced public debate.
It really does seem like history has been this series of, laboratories of failure for both these big ideas. Looking back, none of them really delivered perfectly on their promises, did they?
That's a stark but probably accurate observation. Take state socialism, the Soviet Union model. Outcome: collapse. Why? Repression. Massive inefficiency. Central planning just chunked creativity. Free speech was gone. The economy ran on loyalty, not innovation.
Prove that justice without freedom can be a nightmare.
Absolutely. Then you look at revolutionary socialism, maybe Cuba. Outcome: chronic poverty, deep ideological rigidity. The economy served slogans more than people's needs. Freedoms were curtailed for revolutionary security.
Shows that when revolution becomes ideology, it just freezes things.
Yeah, it gets stuck. Then in Western Europe, you had a form of cultural socialism, maybe strong welfare states, focus on distributive justice, but the outcome there has often been described as an identity crisis.
How so?
Maybe due to extreme relativism, sidelining traditional values, challenges with migration, sometimes restricting speech for psychological safety. It suggests that cultural justice, if it doesn't have boundaries, can lead to a kind of crisis of meaning.
And finally, unbridled capitalism, maybe typified by the U.S. Huge economic power, sure, but the outcome. Severe inequality, wealth concentrated, basic services treated like commodities,
Yeah.
politics often looking like it serves capital first.
Proving that freedom without justice can easily become domination by the powerful.
So yeah, each model failed in its own unique way. Socialism didn't deliver justice without repression. Capitalism didn't preserve freedom without creating massive inequality.
Exactly. And what this points to really is the absolute need for ongoing critique, for constantly redefining these core concepts and trying to get beyond these worn-out black and white binaries.
Okay, so if that's the historical backdrop, how did the left manage to penetrate culture and the digital world so effectively, becoming such a dominant force beyond just elections and policy?
It's a really significant shift. Strategically, the left moved from the streets, you could say, into the core cultural institutions, cinema, for instance, positioned itself as the voice of the oppressed, lots of anti-system, victim-focused narratives, which, let's be honest, sometimes just became cliches. Academia, as we mentioned, critical theory, cultural studies became huge, often framing traditional ideas, truth, rationality, even beauty as just structures of domination.
And then he
Often took on the role of moral arbiter, sometimes quick to label critique as hate speech, shutting down debate.
So that victim narrative, which maybe started as a way to highlight real injustice, it got twisted somehow. Became a tool of domination itself.
That's the argument some make, yeah. Victimhood transformed into a kind of moral privilege, making victims almost immune to questioning.
Right, identity over truth. If you identify as a victim, your story is accepted, sometimes without much scrutiny.
Exactly. Emotions often trumped arguments. The victim figure became almost sacred beyond critique, which ironically creates this victim economy that can actually distort the real pursuit of justice.
And this extended even to art, the idea that the left kind of ideologized art.
Yes, replacing aesthetics or beauty with the message, demanding committed art, sometimes imposing a kind of moral censorship on works that didn't fit the narrative.
So artistic freedom gets squeezed.
It can, yeah. Creativity sometimes takes a backseat to ideological correctness. You even saw it with symbols, like Che Guevara becoming a T-shirt icon, stripped of historical complexity. Art becomes affirmation, maybe, rather than exploration, a tool for cultural shaping.
Okay, and this leads us to maybe the most current and potentially concerning development. Digital leftism and platform control, this idea of the platform socialism. What is that?
This is where things get really subtle and interesting. You have these huge tech companies often talking about democratizing information, right? But they create these systems that look a bit like quasi-socialist structures.
No.
While we, the users, create all the content, generating enormous value, but we don't own the data.
Right, the platforms do.
They collect it, analyze it, sell it. It's like a sharing economy where the individual is mainly a resource to be mined. Our behavior is nudged, guided by algorithms we can't see, shaping what we think. And despite seeming open, these platforms are incredibly centralized, controlling information flow for billions, often with little outside oversight.
And then there's the censorship aspect. Social media becoming a tool for moral policing, often reflecting certain leftist viewpoints.
Yes, that's a major concern for many. Content that doesn't fit the dominant narrative can be flagged, restricted, deleted. Critique gets labeled hate speech. Cancel culture emerges, where people can be digitally ostracized based on interpretations of their speech.
Fostering a kind of fear of expression.
Exactly. Where free speech starts to feel like just the freedom to agree. It's like technology, meant to liberate, has been turned by some into this instrument of subtle control.
What's really striking here is the idea that this digital leftism might be more potent, maybe more dangerous than older forms, because the power is hidden, it's in the code.
It's invisible, yeah. The moral judgments are algorithmic. The speed at which someone can be erased is unprecedented.
So society could be caught in this system of soft control, thinking we're free, but actually being managed and influenced constantly.
That's the fear. It's a very complex, very hidden form of potential domination, arguably more pervasive than old-school government censorship ever was.
So bringing this all together, looking at the big picture, it really does seem like both capitalism's big story, the narrative of freedom, and the left's big story, the narrative of justice, have kind of fallen short.
In significant ways, yes. Capitalism promised freedom, but often delivered it as a privilege for those who would afford it. And certain versions of the left promised justice, but sometimes turned it into a tool for exclusion, even repression. We can coming back to it. Freedom without justice leads to domination. Justice without freedom leads to repression.
Neither grand narrative fully delivered on making humanity truly free and truly just for everyone.
It seems not. Both, in their dominant forms, ultimately failed as complete solutions.
So that begs the massive question. If both these big stories have faltered, what's the alternative? Is there a third path? How do we even start to redefine these vital concepts? Freedom, justice, outside of that old left-right box.
That's the crucial challenge now. Maybe we need to redefine freedom not just as consumer choice, but as something deeper, the actual capability to live well, to think freely, to create.
Okay, and justice.
Not just mechanical equality that ignores differences, but maybe a more dynamic balance of power, of opportunity, of recognizing everyone's inherent dignity.
And fundamentally, it sounds like a shift back to the human.
Exactly. A human-centered narrative, not an ideology-centered one. Putting actual human experience and flourishing first. It means redefining these core ideas based on real life, on history, on our shared humanity, not just repeating tired slogans.
So to quickly recap our deep dive today, we've explored how the left, in its many evolving forms, classical, cultural, digital, moral, seems to have shifted from its original ideals. And in some interpretations has become a kind of new structure of domination itself, often hidden behind moral language or complex technology.
Which is exactly why the end of the left in those forms does not mean the end of critique. In fact, it demands it.
A deeper critique.
A deeper, more continuous critique that goes way beyond just swapping one set of slogans for another. It really forces us to revisit the fundamental philosophical concepts: freedom, justice, dignity.
And to do that properly, we need to redefine them based on human experience, civilizational learning, history. Maybe even re-engage with tradition instead of just dismissing it. It's about getting past the slogan shouting, transcending the day-to-day politics to grapple with deeper meaning, maybe even civilizational purpose.
So here's the thought to leave you with. If both of these grand narratives, capitalism and socialism, have, in their own ways, fallen short of delivering that truly free and just society they promised, what does it mean for you trying to navigate this incredibly complex world?
How do you personally start to redefine these essential concepts? Freedom, justice for a future that hopefully can move beyond these exhausted ideological battles.
Something to think about.
Definitely something to mull over. Until next time on The Deep Dive.